Okay, so what have we learned? That's what we're really going to try to talk about today. Probably to preface it, summarize it in about one sentence is pretty darn good. Implementation's been pretty darn good. I would say probably a whole lot easier than our colleagues in the bovine industry. They've certainly had their share of challenges. For us, we had VFD drugs already, so we were somewhat familiar already with the whole process. It really was a couple of adjustments that we made with the FDA and a whole lot more drugs that we had to write VFDs for. So what we'll do is we'll just talk real quickly here, just give a little bit of background for anybody who may not be very familiar with all the new guidances that took place January 1st of 2017. So just a couple of slides to give some background, and then we'll talk more about what are we seeing. I've got a bunch of frequently asked questions, and I've got a website for you guys. If there's more information that you want, we have official responses from the FDA on some of these frequently asked questions, so we'll go ahead and cover some of those ones that we get the most frequently anyway, and then we'll leave some time at the end for you guys to ask any of your questions. So we had a whole bunch of guidances started in 2010, FDA with all the concerns about antibiotic use in both humans and livestock. So they come out with a series of guidances, 209, 213, VFD, were really written in 2010. The rules were finally established in 2013 with a 3-year implementation period, of which the end of that implementation period was December, I should say the beginning of that implementation period, the end of the phase-in period was December 31st of 2016 with the implementation on January 1st of 2017. There's really 3 key areas that if you tried to boil all those regulations up into what were the key things that were going to change. Number 1 was to limit medically important antibiotics to therapeutic purposes. So let's first talk about what medically important antibiotics is. When they talk to you about medically important antibiotics, they're talking about medically important for human use. So unfortunately, the majority of the products that we use are what's called a shared class. They're shared between livestock and they're shared between humans. That was where the attention and focus on all the new regulations were. So they're saying they want to limit medically important antibiotics to therapeutic purposes only. They recognize that it's a valuable piece to protect animal health and well-being. So what's a therapeutic purpose? Okay? What they're talking about therapeutic is treatment of disease, control of disease, prevention of disease. Okay? So if you look on the label for just about any drug, they're going to have one of 4 different primary purposes of those, either therapeutic or non-therapeutic. Okay? So what they're saying is, and we'll get into the next slide, it's still okay to use those drugs, but only for therapeutic purposes, and now only under the guidance of a veterinarian. Their big push and charge was to get rid of the non-therapeutic uses of medically important antibiotics. It will no longer be permitted. So those labels were pulled as of January 1st. So a non-therapeutic, we're talking about growth promotion, right? So anything where it says on the label, improved growth and feed conversion. So that's low doses of Tylan, low doses of CTC, Stayfac as another example. Those were medically important antibiotics. Where at those low levels, the only thing on the label, because with feed, we can only feed according to the label. There's no extra label drug usage. Veterinarians can prescribe extra label for injectables. They can do it for water, but they cannot do it for feed, okay? So any of those that all they had on the label is anything about improved growth and or improving feed conversion, all those labels for medically important antibiotics, those all disappeared as of January 1st. The third and very important key part of this is they're stating, while we recognize that there's still a need to utilize those products in livestock production, but we want all those uses under strict veterinary oversight, okay? So now veterinary oversight guides all antibiotic decisions on the farm. So in the past, you'd have producers, or producers would be able to go into their feed store, and they would be able to go ahead and buy a bag of aureomycin, okay? And feed it however they wanted to feed it according to the label directions. Well, that was one of the things that they wanted to shortcut, is they wanted to make sure that a veterinarian was involved in making that decision, okay? So what they're saying now is the veterinary oversight, you have to have a valid BCPR, so that's an agreement between the producer and the veterinarian where the veterinarian agrees to make all the medical decisions for the farm, and the producer's portion of that agreement is they will follow the advice of their veterinarian. So what they're saying is it's still okay to use those medically important antibiotics in mass medication. So by mass medication, we're talking about feed or water, okay? And like I said, that really kind of eliminated the over-the-counter usage for mass medication. You will no longer be able to purchase those. If you want to utilize them in the water, you have to write a prescription from your veterinarian. If you want to use a medically important antibiotic in the feed, then you have to get a VFD. And that's really what we'll spend the rest of today talking about. So real quickly, what was affected, what wasn't affected? So there were some antibiotics that were already part of the VFD process, so they were already in there, no big change for them. This is probably the most important list, and unfortunately it's the shorter one. Here are the antibiotics that are not medically important, so for them, nothing changed. You can still feed them at a growth promotion level. You can still go into your feed store without a veterinary prescription or a VFD and purchase these products. Those are ionophores, which are used extensively, more extensively probably in bovine and poultry. We have a product called Skysis, or Narracin in swine. Bacitracin, BMD, Bambamycin, Flavamycin, Carbadox, otherwise better known as Mecadox, or Denagard, with the drug name being Tiamulin. Those can still be used as they have always been used. Those regulations didn't affect them. If you don't see an antibiotic that you use on that list, that's because it's a medically important antibiotic, and those changes certainly were going to affect those. There's some other things that are not antibiotics, so any of the dewormers, Paline, any of the beta agonists, any of the coccidiostats, those didn't affect them because they're not technically antibiotics. So let's talk a little bit about just ensuring for the producers in the room, what's your responsibility within that whole VFD process, okay? So you're going to establish a VCPR with your veterinarian because you're going to have a veterinarian that has to be able to write a prescription if that medically important antibiotic will be used in the water, or a VFD if it's going to be used in the feed. You have to have that relationship. Producers can't just go on the internet and say, hey, I'm going to find some veterinarian who's going to write me a prescription so I can go buy my bag of Oreomycin. That's not valid because in order to have a valid veterinary client-patient relationship, the veterinarian must be intimately familiar with that producer's operation, including a site visit. So the producer, they have to establish that VCPR, they have to ensure that it's valid, and then the producer, the veterinarian, and whoever distributes that feed, so if there's a third party that distributes the feed, if the producer is not mixing it on farm, on themselves, they all have to retain a copy of those VFDs for a 2-year time period and have to be able to reproduce them upon inspection. So what have we seen based on some of these changes so far? I would say in my conversations there isn't a lot of hard evidence out there. There'll be surveys that'll be done. FDA will publish their sales, reports of sales of the different products. They do that every year. We'll see, that'll get published upcoming here for 2016, and we'll see what kind of changes we'll make. We don't really have a good metric today for that. Just in conversations that I've had with producers and veterinarians, generally what they did, like I said, in the swine side, it's been pretty smooth. It's been some additional conversation, some additional paperwork. Some producers have elected to just eliminate those growth promotion uses of antibiotics. And some have chosen just to move it from the medically important to the non-medically important. Okay? And I think a good portion of that just needs to say that's part of the conversation with the VCPR. We need to make sure that a lot of those, it's like, well, geez, I've always raised them on a low dose of a growth promotant. I think it's time to continue to make sure we're having those conversations, and your veterinarian will challenge the producer to say, I know we've always done it that way, but we used to raise them all outside in the winter on dirt lots. Now we bring them indoors. They're all in, all out. We sanitize between groups. Do we really get the benefit that we think we do? And that's been the good part of this, is this continued conversation between producers and veterinarians saying, hey, we want to make sure we're utilizing these antibiotics judiciously. The veterinarian's job will kind of challenge and say, do we still think we still need to use this? Some producers have eliminated the use of antibiotics for growth promotion altogether. They said, hey, we've looked at it. We don't think we're getting any benefit for it, so we're just going to drop it. But I would say the majority of them, from a growth promotion standpoint, has really just migrated over to that non-medically important antibiotic list. Here's some information kindly shared by the group at Global Vet Link. Just a little bit about what they've seen from a VFD standpoint with the information. They're an electronic service that veterinarians can use to electronically not only develop but sign and then distribute VFDs both to producers and to feed mills. Okay, so here's some of their stats as of the first 4 months. You can see obviously they've got it in swine, bovine, and others. They probably had somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000 to $5,000 a year for the 4 years prior to it, and then obviously here the first 4 months they've seen a huge increase in swine and bovine and a few in others, which we'll cover here a little bit. So as to be expected, I would say there's been some estimates out there. I think anywhere between 70 to 80% of the VFDs that are being done today are being done electronically for multiple reasons. For veterinarians, systems like this make it very difficult to write an illegal VFD. So there's a lot of comfort for the veterinarian because the veterinarian is liable for making sure that that VFD is written correctly. It's also good for storage and retention services like these. To be able, if they get inspected, they can just log in and pull all their VFDs up and be able to easily reproduce them upon an audit. So I'd say that's been the vast majority of them have been in an electronic system. Here's the VFDs by species. You can see there have been about 1,204 clinics, a little over 2,300 veterinarians have written VFD within the Global VetLink system. It looks like we're about 2/3 have been bovine and about 1/3 have been swine, a little bit of poultry, a little bit of sheep, and a little bit in others as well. What's been the average number of head per VFD? So some of the specific points with VFDs is there's some flexibility, okay? So some producers have chosen just to write every single, they may have a farm, a sow farm, and they'll have nurseries and finishers, and they're just choosing to write a VFD for every individual lot. Now there were some rule changes in the VFD that would allow you to put multiple lots under the same VFD as long as it's fed by the same producer and fed out of the same feed mill ownership structure. So what you're seeing here is the average number of head per VFD. So you got swine's probably the largest. We've got larger farms, larger systems in there. So you got about 7,000 animals per VFD. For bovine, you're at about 1,100. Ovine, you're about 700. What's kind of interesting is we didn't realize, at least I didn't realize, how many bees, antibiotics were used in honey production, right? So they've got to quantify the number of head. That's one of the things you put on the VFD. So you've got really big poultry, 4.5 million is the average number of head, 320,000 fish, and 20 million bees is the average written on a VFD. So diving more into the swine VFDs, what are we seeing? And really, the significant majority of them are really written for smaller groups, right? You're kind of in that 2,000 to 5,000. That represents approximately about 75,000 VFDs. You've got some that are a little bit larger. They might be writing for multiple sites, all fed out of the same sow farm. They're doing more of a flow-based VFD. So you can see, but that probably only represents anything over 5,000, only represents about 25% of the VFDs written within that system. And the range is pretty wide. It's from as small as 1 pig on a VFD up to 200,000 pigs onto a VFD. So what are they being written for here? So just mining a little bit of data out of that system. And this really would just reflect what's on the FDA annual report. One of the questions that the FDA in their annual report is antibiotic sales, right? So they go to all the manufacturers, they get their sales data, and while that's not exactly usage, that's just sales, it at least gives us some idea of what products are being used out here. So really this information just reflects what's on those FDA reports. Chlorotetracycline or CTC, that's probably the most predominant antibiotic used in swine. Got about 10% in one of the lincomycin products, about another 10% in tylosin, 8% in palmitil, and then everything else is kind of lumped underneath that other category. So this one is listed swine VFDs by active ingredient. So looking at the number of VFDs, this one is looking at the head count by active ingredient, and other than just a couple of percentage moves in the numbers, really says pretty much the same thing there. Maybe a little bit more of oxytetracycline used here than tylosin in the previous example, but CTC still being the majority of the drug that's being used for medically important antibiotics in feed. So what we get in kind of a collaborative effort between the Pork Board and Global VetLink and other organizations is we'll get all these questions in, and kind of what I do within my extension position is I try to go out and get those. I've got to contact my old toxicology professor, is Mike Murphy, who's a VMO within FDA, and he's been kind enough, I'll collect these questions, I send them to him, and he can kind of fast track and get some information back here. So what we'll do kind of the rest of the time, we'll talk about some of these frequently asked questions And then I'll have a website where you can get a bigger document that has all the ones that we've gotten responses back from FDA. I just kind of cherry-picked some of the ones that I get more frequently. So, one question is, who's responsible for monitoring the appropriate amount of feed issued under a VFD? Is that the producer, or is that the feed distributor if they're getting that information, or sorry, they're using a third-party service to deliver their feed? So I'm going to list the whole responses, and then I'll just try to cover, highlight, bold a couple of those that try to call your attention to. And really what they're saying is it's really a shared responsibility between the distributor and the client as far as monitoring the amount of feed issued to fill a VFD. Now, the feed distributors, those that are FDA inspected, they've been FDA inspected for years. They've got programs such as FSMA and other food safety programs, so they're used to FDA audits. So they have a keen eye. If they see something on a VFD and it's not quite matching up, they'll probably be the ones that are the gatekeeper. They'll be calling the producer, calling the veterinarian, "Now, are you sure this is right?" So on and so forth. So it's not really anyone's responsibility. FDA would say it's a shared responsibility with the distributor, that the order contains the appropriate amount of feed, and it says the quantity, so the amount of that feed should be commensurate with the approximate number of animals. So I had to Google commensurate. I wasn't exactly sure what that means. That's corresponding in size or degree or proportion. So in other words, the quantity of feed being fed should be in proportion to the number of animals that are listed on that VFD. One thing that happens quite commonly in pig production, pigs get weaned. They probably go on an early wean diet, and that usually is a bagged feed, and that may be a specialized feed made from one distributor, but then they're rolling over. So they may feed some bagged feed the first 7 days, and then the next 7 days they want to use the same drug, but then they want to start feeding out of the bulk bins, right? So we get this question for medication that's split into pelleted feed from one feed distributor, followed by mash feed from a different distributor, and it's the same drug. Does that require one VFD, two VFDs? How are we supposed to handle that? So FDA was kind enough to give a response, and it really says it's kind of predetermined if it's from two different distributors during that same VFD duration. So let me give you an example of that. A very common one might be CTC or Denagard Plus, which is the combination of Denagard and CTC. That's written for 14 days duration. So in other words, to a group of pigs that needs to be fed for 14 days. Well, the producer may want to feed it for the first 7 days with this early wean pellet that I get from some specialized manufacturing process. And then the next 7 days, in order to fulfill that 14-day duration, I need that to come out of the mill that I always use here, and that needs to be mash feed. What that's saying is the veterinarian then, they can write it all underneath one, but the veterinarian should indicate in the special instructions portion, which I'll show you where that is here in a second, the distributor of the VFD for each portion of that treatment period. In other words, how much of it should be feed A, how much of it should be feed B. Each distributor will then provide an amount of feed that is commensurate, there's that word commensurate again, in approximation to the number of animals and the portion of the treatment period for which the distributor is responsible. In other words, that says, well, mill A, I'm going to feed approximately 7 days worth of intake in my pellets, and then mill B, I'm going to give you enough feed in your bulk bin, but it's only going to be for the next 7 days, okay? So here's that website. I'll have it again at the end. We've got all these under an VFD FAQ. It's at the Iowa Pork Industry Center there at Iowa State. So it's www.ipic.iastate.edu. If you go under info, vfdfaq.pdf, and I'll have that information again here at the end. So really what it's saying is, and what we'll talk about is, there's going to be cases where the special instructions, there's really nothing that legally ties that to it. So the FDA compliance inspectors, what they've been saying is, use that section to try to explain what you're doing. If it's not really clear, use that special instruction section for the veterinarian and the producer to specifically write out what's going to happen with that VFD. Because when the inspector, they just want to be able to show up and tie all that stuff back together, okay? So here's an example. This is courtesy of Zoetis Animal Health. Here's a VFD. There's a special instructions or other animal identifiers. That's that way on there. That's where that information that we just talked about, splitting that up, would be put. Here's in Global Vet Link. There's a section here under the the budgeted amount, the duration, and special instructions. So that's where that information should go to help explain. What that does is just makes the audit process go that much easier. And what it does is the more specific that the veterinarian can be in the special instructions, just eliminates all the questions or all the phone calls between the distributor and between the veterinarian trying to explain what's going to happen with this VFD order. This was provided by Mr. Jeff Verzal, who works for the Iowa Department of Ag, does some contracting with FDA to do some of these audits. So let's say you're doing a VFD for a flow, right? So we're going to put multiple sites underneath one VFD because all those pigs, the first 2 weeks, they're getting Denegard and CTC, let's say, for example. So if you could put under the special instructions, hey, we're putting 1,000 pigs in here, how often they arrive, and the approximate average weight of those animals, just helps the feed distributor know exactly how they need to mill that feed and then how they need to keep track of those records. And also makes it easier upon an FDA inspection to be able to explain what you're doing. So for an example, you may say, well, we're going to do this across my 20 finishing sites, right? They're all going to get fed the first 2 weeks. They're going to get fed Denegard CTC on the end, and 1,000 head enters that facility every 8 weeks, and they weigh approximately 12 pounds per head. Okay, so that's the type of information that can be in the special instructions. Makes it easier for the inspector. Also makes it easier for the feed distributor. So I can say I'll just make that whole process flow a lot easier. If the VFD states a duration of feeding or a feeding interval, whether it's 5 days or 14 days to feed that drug, that's one thing to say. We'll talk about pulse dosing here in a second. Is just to make sure that people are aware that on those medications, when you write a medication, that can only be used, a VFD can only be written once. So if you got a group of 1,000 animals and you're going to go ahead and use a product, you can use it one time. There's no refills on any of the labels for VFD products, okay? So if you're going to feed it in a pulse situation, that's kind of the next question, right? What's a pulse dose? So a pulse is using the same antibiotic in the same group of animal at 2 different times. So you may say, well, for disease control, I like to pulse in the first 2 weeks on entry into finishing, and then 8 weeks later, I like to do another pulse, okay? Well, you can't write all that underneath one VFD because VFD is written one time for one drug in the same group of animals, okay? So if you're going to do that, you can do that because there's no refills, but the recommendation to get around that is you have to write 2 different VFDs, okay? So you write one for the first pulse and you write one for the second pulse. And then the veterinarian has to have some justification for why they went ahead in their medical opinion or diagnostics to help verify that. Why did they go back and have to use the second pulse? So can still be done. Just be aware that you can't utilize the same drug in the same group of animals more than one time. If you're going to do that, you need a VFD for each of those pulses, which is what we'd call that. This is probably, as I talked to a few people that have gotten a few audits, this is probably going to be the area that we probably have to pay the most close attention to, is the duration of feeding, right? So it's always said on the label for most of these products, feed it for 5 days, feed it for 14 days. And in the past, in swine, especially if you're working with a large toll mill, you got a large site with bens, well, it gets fed for 14 days, and that's, let's say that's 15 or 16 tons, but I like to fill my truck up to 18 tons, right? So I'm just going to fill it up to 18 tons and call it good. That should get us about 14 days worth of feed. So as we've started to have that interaction and asking some of those questions, we say, well, how close does it have to be? Does it have to be exactly 14 days? Can it be 13 days, 20 days? And really the early indications have been, and FDA has really said probably for this first year, they're really going in education mode, right? So they're coming out when they do the inspections. If they find something wrong, they're just talking to the producer about it, talking to the veterinarian, say, how are we going to develop a plan to make sure we shore this up? They're really not coming out with fines right out of the gate unless you've got a producer that just said, hey, I want to use it however I want to use it. I don't care about the rules, okay? But this is one where we could potentially have some issues. You know, what the early indications are, they expect it to be fairly close. So if it says for not more than 14 days, that means, yeah, maybe 15 days, maybe 16, but not 20, right? Same for Palmitil shall be fed to pigs for for not more than 21 days. Here's some different ones. Their expectation is the regulators, they're going to be pretty close to the label. And unfortunately, this is a little bit, even though it's a federal program, you're still subject to the human-to-human or the auditor-to-auditor variation. You may get one that says, I expect 14 days exactly, right? Other ones, some people we've talked to said, yeah, they may have a little wiggle room with a day or two of it, but just because it's easier for the mill to send out a 24-ton truck, so 14 days turns into 20 days, that's not going to work. And that's going to be, that'll be on the producer and the feed distributor to do whatever they have to do to tighten that up. So I would say if I thought about where could we be at risk for producers and audits today, I would say the duration of feeding is probably the one that I would be most concerned about. I think everything else will do a good job. The rest of it's just really making sure we have all the paperwork filed and ordered and written properly. But this duration of feeding is one that we need to keep an eye on. One common question we get is about contract growers, right? Because it's written with the producer, the veterinarian, and the feed distributor. So the producer, you say, okay, so I've got a contract grower. They don't own the pigs, but the owner of the pigs is listed as the client on there. Are they required to have a copy of the VFD on site? That's typically a common question we get, especially here in Iowa with a lot of contract growers. Okay, so this gets really long and winded. You can certainly read through that at your leisure, and once again, this information will be on there. What they're saying is, essentially, the client could have a number of locations on a VFD. The VFD, can be fed in accordance to it, so they can have a physical copy of at each location, or it may be done by providing electronic access. So the concern is they got a contract grower, they get inspected. Hey, the company is maybe in a different state. They have all that information at their central office. What do they do if an inspector shows up and wants to see a copy of the VFD? And what they're really saying is if it's in the case where the client is not the contractor, the client is the owner of the pigs who may be away from the site, they can either have a copy of the VFD on the site, so when they respect it or they request it, or the contractor needs to have access to be able to quickly get that, whether it's a fax or it's a login to an email, or somebody from the central office emails that VFD to the contract grower. The contract grower is expected to be able to reproduce that in a relatively short time period. So if it was me and I was a contract grower, I'd say, hey, central office, just send me a copy of all my VFDs, so if an auditor shows up, I can get access to it. Or if you've got a way I can log into a system and pull that up, like Global VetLink, for example, great. Or if I call you and you can send me an email of the VFD so the auditor can look at it, those are all acceptable answers to be able to do that. What if the situation's a little bit different and the contract grower is actually listed as the client or the caretaker? Because if you look in the rules, it talks about the client is either the owner of the animals or other caretakers. So it could potentially be, in that case, it could be the contract grower, okay? So what happens if that's the case? If the person listed on there isn't necessarily the owner of the pig, it's the caretaker or the contract grower. So for those purposes, it can be done by having a physical copy of the VFD at a location, or it may be done by providing electronic access to the VFD stored in a central location. So once again, really the answer is the same. As long as you can quickly be able to reproduce a copy of that information upon inspection, either way is going to be fine. That's a common one that we get. What are some of the potential inspection questions if we do get some? Like I say, I've only been aware that there's been a handful of inspections that have actually occurred so far. And like I say, generally they've been pretty much checking the documentation. These are kind of the questions that you may expect to get. Does the client keep copies of the VFD for 2 years? Did the client feed the VFD feed to the authorized number of animals on the VFD form? Did the client feed for the identified duration of the orders? So once again, they're going to be looking at duration. Did the client stop feeding it prior to the expiration date, or did they get another VFD in order to continue to fill that? Did the client follow the withdrawal period for the VFD, if there was any? Those are just some of the potential questions that you might get. And like I say, I've just heard, through talking to colleagues, it's probably just been a handful so far. And like I say, most of them have just been about making sure that they've got all the information on the VFD is kept correctly. But there have been a couple of them that they've asked about the duration, and their expectations is the feed mill So a VFD, like we say, is kind of like a permission slip, right? So commonly what happens is a veterinarian can write it for any length of period, but no longer than 6 months. So each VFD can be written for a 6-month time period. But you might order 20 different feed orders underneath that one VFD, okay? So the client, the veterinarian, and the feed distributor, they all have to retain a copy of the VFD for 2 years. But then the feed distributor for sure has to be able to show all the feed distributions, so all those individual 20 loads that went underneath that VFD, they need to be able to reproduce it. And I would tell clients, if I'm feeding a medically important feed on my farm, I would have a way of documenting on my records. Here's the date I started, here's the date I finished, so that upon inspection, they're able to go back and reconcile all that information. What about indications for use? So this is a question I get from a lot of veterinarians, right? So what, are they going to, if it says control on the label and I'm using it as control or treatment, or maybe it's prevention, or it says for this disease, but I have that disease plus some other ones, our inspector is going to come out and really challenge on that. And really FDA and some of these frequently asked questions, they've been pretty consistent to say that the inspectors are not in the practice of veterinary medicine, so they're not going to be challenging your veterinarian on how they're using it, not at least initially. But I think over time what you'll see is they'll get more pressure. Veterinarians are going to have to do a good job of documenting and give good evidence of both the VCPR and the reasons for those indications. So over time, as I do these lectures to some of my colleagues, my advice is I would start, doing some routine diagnostics on producer sites. If you're feeding it for this, I would go out and make sure you're doing diagnostics when they have sick pigs. Make sure you can provide evidence that, yep, we're feeding it for this reason because here's the bug that we find. Just like I say, I don't think they're said very clearly they're not in the practice of challenging them right away, but over the years time period, policies change, opinions change, things like that. So especially in this prevention and control arena, that's what all our opponents now is, okay, well, it's good you got growth promotants gone, but now all you're going to do is feed the same drug, and instead of growth promotion, you're going to call it prevention. So there's a lot more pressure now on the next thing they're going after is prevention claims. What about antibiotic alternatives? Actually, this was done by Wes Schweer and Dr. Gabler and Kristen Olson, and I know Wes talked yesterday here at Pork Academy, talked about the research that they've done on antibiotic alternatives. This is one of the slides that he would have presented yesterday, and this is really just a summary of 1,700 papers that have been published on antibiotic alternatives, listed by the different alternatives. And really what they're saying is when they went in and looked at, did they see an average daily gain response or not when they did these? The ones there in gray, those are ones that showed no response. The ones in yellow are the ones that showed a good response in average daily gain. And the ones in black are the ones that actually showed a negative response. And it's really to say, now with the pressure to reduce antibiotics, we're seeing a lot of these alternatives, but at least in the scientific literature, most of the time, they don't really tend to show any difference. There's certainly certain indications where it works well, but I think it's been demonstrated, and this group is working on a research project that they'll probably share next year looking at some head-to-head stuff with antibiotics, and especially in disease situations, antibiotics are still the best tool that we have. So it's really just to say, just be careful. Excuse me, be wary of antibiotic alternatives without rigorously scientifically tested and if possible, in your herd. Don't just assume that these are non-antibiotics and they work just as good as antibiotics. So a little bit, the last couple of minutes, talking about what are things that are coming at us. This slide was courtesy of Dr. Wagstrom, who is NPPC's chief veterinarian. Our opponents, like I said, they're really working on this prevention and duration. They're very wary about prevention. Duration, we have some drugs that don't have a defined period. Some of the examples I fed before are feed for 5 days or feed for 14 days. Well, most of the growth promotions didn't have it, right? It's just for improved weight gain or feed efficiency, and you could feed it however long that you wanted. We still have a few medically important antibiotics that have either have a very long duration of use, so they're still getting a lot of feedback and a lot of pressure about restricting that duration of use. And like I say, prevention, here's what are we seeing now? Well, the FDA has basically said, well, here's how we're going to manage it. But now what you're seeing is states are, very similar to the gestation stall debate, right? The sow housing debate. Now individual states are in the process of potentially passing laws against routine use of antibiotics for prevention. There's been a couple of laws that have already been passed in California and in Maryland. Another bill that's under consideration for Oregon, which in those cases would need very specific and extensive veterinary justification for very special and documental circumstances to be able to use antibiotics for disease prevention. So, like you say, growth promotion for medically important antibiotics, that was probably one that, we got other alternatives, we're fine, but, our opponents are going to really start to focus on this prevention usage now, so, which certainly there's cases where that's a very important tool to protect animal health and well-being, so that's kind of where I think the battle lines will start to begin to be drawn. But for producers working with the veterinarians, make sure, I think this is really about increasing the amount of documentation, right? So maybe we don't traditionally do diagnostics, but let's do some diagnostics on our farm for disease X to justify this is why we use it in this methodology, because I think down the road, the more documentation that you have, the better off you are. Usually when things get to a legal thing, it's he or she who documents best is who wins those type of debates. So I would say the more documentation you can do with your veterinarians are going to put us in a much better position. Resources, multiple places to get this. Like I said, there's that Iowa Pork Industry Center website. We relaunched that here at the spring of the year. We've got a whole section there. There's the address. You go to the Diseases and Health tab. We've got an FAQ for VFDs, a very extensive list. I only covered a few of them on their FDA website. You can send questions directly to the FDA and for a response. Pork.org here, actually our pork checkoff dollars at work, they have a very nice resource center, and Global Vet Link as well has got a bunch of information as well to be able to share with you. So with that, I'll take any questions if there are any questions from the audience. Yeah, so the question is, if I've got a producer who may feed, have all animals listed in one VFD, they're all fed out of the same mill, but may be fed in two different states. I'm not sure I've had that question specifically. Have you, Tyler? I'll probably have Tyler talk to you real quick, just because he's fielded a bunch there through Global Vet Link.
I pull real hard. Yeah, so the thing to consider is where the veterinarian is licensed. So as long as the veterinarian is licensed in both states and it's coming from the same mill or the same business entity, you can have it on the same VFD. So you can have animals different states in the same VFD, but the veterinarian needs to be licensed for both states or multiple states, and it needs to come from the same business entity of a feed distributor. So it can be one.
Good question.
Yeah. You kind of answered it a little bit, but in pulse dosing, what's the burden of proof for failed medication failure to allow you to do the second?
To do the second pulse. Yeah, I would say initially that probably goes back to that slide about FDA and the inspectors aren't going to be in the business of veterinary medicine. So I think as long as you have the veterinarian has some documentation, in my clinical experience with this herd, here's what we see, and we see it at multiple times, both at the beginning and at the end for bugs that are on the label. That probably will be simple and suffice enough. But if they don't have anything at all, that may raise a red flag. I know that was an issue that the industry groups and the FDA had to go back and forth with, because there were people in the FDA crowd that like, hey, wait a minute, that's a treatment failure. It's like, but the people that were in the public health arena, they understood population immunity and the need to dose, a product multiple times. So that was kind of the compromise, was to do the multiple doses. But yeah, like I say, I don't think initially they'll be on that, but my advice to veterinarians is to make sure where you can document.
Yes. Can you address any compliance activities that are going to occur or anticipated in terms of, right now it's we've just got started to the year and learning but eventually something's going to go wrong and somebody's going to have to enforce something.
Yeah, so the question really is about, so when does the compliance portion of that? So that question was asked last year, are they going to come out writing speeding tickets or come out writing warning tickets? And, in their legalese and about a 3-paragraph, they said, hey, we're going to start out doing education. They haven't really listed a defined time period, but I know some colleagues that I serve on an expert panel with, they're kind of like, yeah, when you get them behind closed doors and not publicly, they're probably thinking the first year or so they're going to be okay, but after that, and I really think because they're learning right with us. I mean, we've given these questions and they're like, yeah, that sounds okay. I think they're kind of learning as they're going too. I think if you're doing everything that you can and it's a simple, honest mistake, at least initially, I think they're going to be lenient. Now, in some places, you got some people are like, hey, that's just how I want to do it, and that's how I've always done it, and I'm going to keep doing it. Yeah, those people are probably up for, they're probably not going to get so much education. They might wind up, getting a fine right out of the get-go. But at least initially here, and is that a year or longer? I don't know. I think if you're doing everything that you can, I think they're going to be lenient for you. But eventually, yeah, they'll have to start doing some enforcement after if they get a feel for like, hey, yeah, we've been educating people for 3 years on this. That's a mistake you probably shouldn't have made. And as I sit back and look at it, I think most of it's fairly simple and straightforward. Like I said before, the one I get concerned about is the duration of use, because we've probably been pretty loose with that over the time with working with feed mills to optimize loads and things like that. If it says 14 days, most of those weren't written with ranges. It was 14 days. Their expectation is going to be awful close to 14 days is what the expectation is going to be. So, yes, question over there.
Duration use again. So, for not on some of those drugs, do not feed for more than 14. Do not feed for more than 21. Well, what happens on the underside?
Yeah.
So, if the 21 gets only for 14 days,
Right.
which would be grossly.
Yeah, they don't say, and the trickier one's obviously the one that says feed for 21 days exactly, right? I think on anything shorter than, because that's less antibiotic usage, I don't think they're going to be as concerned about that. So if I got to choose what side of the line I want to be on, I probably want to be under and not over. Like I say, if something comes up, you have a question that comes across later, there's my email address. Like I say, between myself and the Pork Board and Global Vet Link and any other AASV, any of those organizations, I've been trying to compile the list of those questions. And like I say, when we get some back, and I just got 2 or 3 of those that you saw were just ones I just got back here last week. We'll update that on the Iowa Pork Industry website. So we kind of got this running VFD document for some of these frequently asked questions. So.
Yes.
Chris, you want to just reiterate what your recommendations are, what best practices you're seeing to document duration when you're on the farm? I mean, so
Yeah.
you mentioned that as a key issue.
Yes.
So what might be a best
Yeah.
practice?
That's a good question. What I would tell you, some people say, well, I just use feed tickets, right, because feed tickets get delivered. I would tell you, talking to a couple of people who've done these type of inspections in the past, their ideal world would be, I've got a section on my barn card. Say you got a barn card to keep track of your mortality and your feed deliveries, but you would have on there for every medically important drug, I started kind of like a water medication, right? I started on this date, I finished it on this date. I mean, that would be the ideal way I would think about documented, Tyler. That's a good question, though. And then hopefully, upon an FDA inspection, they'll look at that. They'll go look at the feed distribution. They'll try to do the math to make sure it's commensurate, right? It kind of goes back to that term. How much of feed should you have approximately fed through that time period? So I think that would be the simplest and easiest way. But I'd say a lot of people probably don't necessarily do it that way.